an 8-year-old boy was forced to live through hell for months before taking his final breath in a hospital bed. The most horrifying part was that the people torturing him were his own mother and stepfather. He cried for help. Teachers reported the abuse. Neighbors grew suspicious. But in the end, no one managed to save him before it was too late. I'm Detective Johnny, someone who uncovers disturbing, mysterious, and deeply haunting cases. And this is the heartbreaking story of Gabriel Fernandez, a tragic child whose life ended far too soon. Gabriel Fernandez was born in 2005 in Los Angeles. From the very beginning, his childhood was nothing like that of most other children. Gabriel did not truly grow up in the care of his biological mother. For most of his early years, he was raised by his grandparents and other relatives. Life was far from comfortable. The house was always crowded, filled with the constant arguments of a struggling working-class family. But even in the middle of that chaos, Gabriel still had something many children need most: the feeling of being loved and protected. Everyone who cared for Gabriel later described him in almost the same way. He was incredibly gentle. Gabriel loved to smile, loved running around the yard, loved hugging the adults around him, and always tried to make them happy. And he was the kind of child who could stay happy for an entire day just because someone praised him once. Even at a very young age, Gabriel had already learned how to read other people's emotions, as if he was always afraid of becoming a burden to anyone. No one realized that those difficult years, despite the poverty, would become the most peaceful days of his short life. Then everything began to change. When Gabriel was 7 years old, his biological mother, Pearl Fernandez, suddenly decided to bring him to live with her in Palmdale. At the time, she was living with her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre. For Gabriel, that should have been a happy moment. Every child longs to be close to their mother. Perhaps he believed that he was finally going to have a real family. But no one knew that the day Gabriel walked into that house was also the day the nightmare began. At first, no one believed that decision would lead to such a horrifying tragedy. Gabriel's family thought that living with his biological mother might finally give him a more stable life. But within just a few months, the people around him began to sense that something was terribly wrong behind the doors of that house. Gabriel Fernandez was no longer the energetic little boy who loved to smile and run around. He became quiet. His eyes were almost always lowered, as if he were afraid of something. Gabriel barely spoke anymore and seemed terrified of interacting with adults. People who had known him before later said the change was frighteningly fast, as though, in only a short time, someone had completely stolen his childhood away. Then the injuries began to appear. At first, there were only a few bruises on his arms. Later came scratches, swollen lips, bloodshot eyes, and other strange marks across the little boy's body. Some days, Gabriel arrived at school looking exhausted, as if he had not slept for nights. But what worried his teachers the most was the way he constantly tried to hide everything. Even under the dry, scorching heat of Palmdale, Gabriel still wore long sleeves to school every single day. He would pull the sleeves down as far as possible, barely exposing any skin. It was the kind of behavior many teachers had seen before in abused children. One day, Gabriel came to school with badly swollen lips and one eye so red it looked as though he had been struck hard in the face. His teacher immediately pulled him aside and asked what had happened. "What happened to you?" The little boy just stood there silently, his head lowered, his hands tightly clenched together. After a few seconds of silence, Gabriel quietly answered in a barely audible voice, "I fell." That was almost always his answer. He fell in the bathroom. He fell down the stairs. He bumped into a table. He hurt himself by accident. The explanations were so weak that any adult could tell the boy was lying. But the most heartbreaking part was that Gabriel seemed to have already learned how to protect the very people who were hurting him. But eventually, the warning signs became far too obvious to ignore. At school, the teachers began to genuinely fear for Gabriel Fernandez, not only because of the injuries covering the little boy's body, but because of the look in his eyes. It was the expression of a child living in constant fear. Gabriel often arrived at school exhausted, dirty, and hungry. Some days he would flinch whenever an adult accidentally touched his shoulder. One teacher later recalled that the boy behaved as though he was always expecting to be hit. Then one day, the school decided they could no longer stay silent. A teacher noticed that Gabriel had far too many suspicious injuries and immediately filed a report with the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. And it was not the only report. The multiple calls had already been made by teachers, relatives, and people who had interacted with Gabriel. They all expressed the same fear. The boy might be suffering severe abuse. Social workers later visited the house where Gabriel lived with Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre. They spoke with the family, briefly observed the home, asked a few questions. Then they left. Gabriel was still left inside that house. No one removed him. No one realized that behind the door that had just closed, a real nightmare was waiting for him. According to prosecutors, the abuse Gabriel endured became more horrifying over time. The little boy was beaten almost every day. Sometimes he was forced to kneel for hours. Other times, he was locked inside cramped spaces as punishment. He was frequently starved and humiliated through acts of cruelty that were almost impossible to comprehend. The most heartbreaking part was that Gabriel was still just a child, a little boy so small that at times he barely seemed capable of asking for help. The people around him saw the warning signs, reports were filed, the alarms came early, but none of it was enough to save him. Life for Gabriel Fernandez inside that house became almost a continuous cycle of torture. The little boy was repeatedly punished in ways that were unimaginably cruel. There were days when Gabriel was locked for hours inside a dark space, so pitch black that he could barely tell whether it was day or night. It was not a room meant for a child. There were no toys, no warm light, only suffocating silence and a fear that seemed endless. Many times, Gabriel could do nothing but curl up alone on the cold floor, listening to footsteps echo through the hallway, while wondering when the next burst of anger would come. He was constantly punished whenever he did something that displeased his mother or stepfather. Sometimes Gabriel was forced to kneel for so long that his small body could barely endure it. Other times, he was made to stand silently for hours, not allowed to cry, not allowed to resist. Even food became a form of punishment. Hunger, isolation, and fear slowly turned into a normal part of the little boy's daily life. What haunted many investigators later was not only the injuries covering Gabriel's body, but the feeling that the child had spent far too long living in anticipation of pain. An 8-year-old boy who should have been sleeping peacefully, going to school, and playing like any other child, was instead living day after day as though he were simply trying to survive an endless nightmare. And the most terrifying part was that all of this was happening in the middle of an ordinary neighborhood in Palmdale. Neighbors later said they had often heard screaming coming from the house late at night. Sometimes it was the sound of a child crying. Sometimes it was the furious shouting of adults. Then suddenly, everything would fall silent again. No one truly understood how horrific the nightmare behind those doors had become. What broke many people's hearts afterward was the fact that Gabriel had tried to ask for help. Not once, but many times. At school, the little boy quietly told a teacher, "My mom hates me. It did not sound like the angry complaint of a child. Everyone who heard those words later remembered the despair in Gabriel's eyes when he said them. On another occasion, just before the school day ended, Gabriel admitted that he was afraid to go home. So afraid that he did not want to leave the classroom. So afraid that school, a place meant only for learning, had become the only place where he felt safe. But in the end, like every other day, Gabriel was still sent back to that house, back to the place where no one knew what he would be forced to endure that night. Then came the day when everything finally collapsed. In May 2013, an emergency call was made from the house where Gabriel Fernandez was living with his biological mother and her boyfriend. When paramedics arrived, they found the little boy lying motionless in critical condition. Gabriel was rushed to the hospital. But from the moment doctors first saw Gabriel Fernandez in the emergency room, many of them immediately understood that this was not a normal accident. The boy was brought in barely responsive. His small body looked almost swallowed by the medical equipment and the cold white lights of the emergency room. Doctors began emergency treatment immediately, but after only a few minutes of examination, the atmosphere in the room became noticeably heavier, because what they saw on Gabriel's body did not resemble the injuries from a simple fall. It looked like the evidence of suffering that had lasted for months. Old and new injuries covered the little boy's body. Some bruises had already darkened with age, as though they had been there for days. Mixed among them were fresh wounds, suggesting that the abuse had continued shortly before Gabriel was brought to the hospital. One doctor later said that what haunted him most was not only the severity of the injuries, but the feeling that there was almost no part of Gabriel's body that had not been hurt. Inside the emergency room, the sound of heart monitors echoed rapidly between hurried footsteps and urgent conversations from the medical staff. Nurses moved constantly around the hospital bed, and no one said it aloud. But many people in that room understood that Gabriel had endured something horrific for a very long time. And the harder the doctors fought to save him, the more they realized a heartbreaking truth. This was not a battle to save a child who had just suffered an accident. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the life of a child who had been destroyed, piece by piece, in silence. Signs of abuse appeared everywhere on his body, as though Gabriel had lived in pain for far too long. Doctors and nurses who were present in the emergency room later admitted that the scene haunted them for years. One physician described it as one of the most heartbreaking and unforgettable cases of his entire career. Inside the hospital room, medical machines continued to sound relentlessly while doctors fought desperately to keep the 8-year-old boy alive. But the damage Gabriel had suffered was too severe. He had sustained catastrophic brain injuries. His body was weakened from prolonged abuse. In the end, despite every desperate effort by the medical team, Gabriel Fernandez died not long afterward. He was only 8 years old. Gabriel's short life ended in a cold hospital room, not because of illness, not because of an accident, but because the people who should have protected him the most were the very ones destroying him day after day. That very night, police in Palmdale sealed off the house where Gabriel Fernandez had been living. At first, the case was treated as an unusual child death investigation. But after only a few hours of examining the scene, investigators began to realize they were facing one of the most horrifying child abuse cases many of them had ever encountered. Inside the house, everything felt unbearably cold. The air was heavy, silent, suffocating. Investigators later said there were details that immediately made them understand Gabriel had not been living like a normal child inside that home. The place where the little boy slept did not resemble the bedroom of an 8-year-old child. It looked more like a space designed for punishment. Cramped, bare, completely lacking the warmth, comfort, or sense of safety that a child should feel at home. Police discovered numerous signs indicating that Gabriel had suffered abuse over a long period of time. It was not only the injuries found on the boy's body, but also the disturbing details scattered throughout the house itself, evidence of an environment built on fear and control. Many investigators later admitted that the crime scene haunted them deeply, because the longer they looked around that house, the more painful it became to imagine a small child being forced to live there every single day, in silence, loneliness, and constant fear. After Gabriel Fernandez died, his biological mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, were immediately taken to the police station for separate interrogations. During the first few hours, both of them repeatedly changed their stories. They claimed Gabriel was a troublesome child. They said he often hurt himself. They insisted the bruises came from frequent falls and accidents around the house. But the longer the questioning continued, the more contradictions began to appear in their statements. Investigators started placing evidence on the table one piece at a time. Medical reports from the hospital, records of injuries that had accumulated over months, statements from teachers and school staff, calls that had previously been made to Child Protective Services, and the disturbing evidence discovered inside the house itself. Slowly, the pieces came together, forming a horrifying picture that could no longer be denied. When confronted with all of that evidence, both of their stories began to collapse. Eventually, Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre admitted that Gabriel had been regularly punished over a long period of time. But what they called punishment was, in reality, prolonged torture inflicted on an 8-year-old child. Gabriel was isolated, deprived of food, and forced to live in fear almost every day. He was constantly punished whenever he did something that displeased his mother or stepfather. Some days, he was forced to stand still for hours while being screamed at continuously and isolated from everyone else in the house. And neighbors later said they often heard crying and shouting coming from the home at night, though no one truly understood what was happening behind those doors. According to later testimony, Gabriel lived in a near-constant state of fear. Even at school, teachers noticed that the little boy would flinch whenever adults approached him, as though he had become conditioned to expect punishment for even the smallest mistakes. Investigators later admitted that some details revealed during the interrogations left the entire room in silence. Even detectives who had worked on brutal homicide cases said they were deeply disturbed by the cruelty involved. One investigator stated that he had never seen a child forced to live in fear for such a long and intense period of time. Gabriel was not simply beaten. The little boy appeared to spend every day waiting for the next moment of pain. What haunted many people most was the fact that Gabriel endured everything in silence for so long. An 8-year-old child, who should have been worried only about school and friends, was instead living as though he were simply trying to survive one more day. When the full details of the case involving Gabriel Fernandez were finally revealed to the public, outrage spread rapidly across the United States. People were not only horrified by what Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre had done to an 8-year-old child, they were also asking a far more painful question. How could something like this continue for so long, without anyone stopping it? Because the more people learned about the case, the more they realized this was not a tragedy that had happened entirely in secret. The warning signs had appeared very early. Gabriel's teachers had repeatedly reported suspected abuse after noticing injuries on the little boy's body. Some later said that simply looking into Gabriel's eyes was enough to understand that he was living in fear. The neighbors had heard screaming coming from the house late at night. Relatives also noticed disturbing changes in the child. Even social workers from the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services had personally visited the house to investigate. but they still left. And Gabriel was still left behind in that house. That detail became one of the most infuriating parts of the entire case. Because after everything came to light, many people realized that Gabriel had not died only because of the cruelty of two abusers. He had also become the victim of a system that failed to protect him. Across television broadcasts and social media, the case became a nationwide shock. People organized memorials for Gabriel with flowers, candles, and stuffed animals placed outside the school and neighborhood where he had once lived. Many broke down in tears while looking at photographs of the little boy smiling innocently, unable to comprehend how a child like that could have suffered such unimaginable pain throughout his short life. And what continued to haunt people for years afterward was the feeling that Gabriel had tried to ask for help many times. It was simply that no one managed to save him before it was too late. After months of investigation and court proceedings, the trial surrounding the death of Gabriel Fernandez finally came to an end. Inside the courtroom, the details revealed were so heartbreaking that many people could not hold back their tears. Prosecutors described Gabriel's life as a prolonged cycle of suffering, where a small child was subjected to a level of cruelty that even experienced investigators struggled to comprehend. In the end, Isauro Aguirre was sentenced to death for his direct role in Gabriel's death. Meanwhile, Pearl Fernandez received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to avoid the death penalty. But for many people, no punishment could erase the heartbreak this case left behind. Even I, someone who has read through thousands of criminal files, cold-blooded murders, and some of the most horrifying cases imaginable, sat in silence for a long time after learning about the story of Gabriel Fernandez. Because the most haunting part was not only what the little boy suffered, it was the fact that so many people saw the warning signs, yet in the end, no one truly managed to save him. And perhaps, if someone had listened to that child just a little longer, things might have turned out differently. If you made it this far, leave a moment of remembrance for Gabriel. And don't forget to follow the channel as we continue uncovering some of the world's most disturbing and haunting criminal cases.